Hello, everyone. You might notice that there's a change in the title of my presentation. And so I want to start off by talking about why that is. The initial focus, the project that I proposed when I was applying to this position, had a focus on international large-scale assessments. You might have heard of PISA, is the most famous one, and how they are used to influence education reform in developing countries. However, what I saw in practice was that I proposed to investigate a trend that I thought would be influential. In practice, the trend was not as influential as I thought it would be. And so I shifted the focus to a different policy trend related to privatization, where there is much more activity and it's much more consequential. So the revised focus was on global local dynamics in privatization trends related to education reform in Latin America. So here we see stronger trends, more activity, and it has been more influential, whereas PISA has not been as impactful as expected in recent years, and it has been more symbolic in nature. So the point is that understanding privatization is more relevant to the Latin American education reform. So what I'll be sharing with you today is some insights from what I've been working on these past few years related to this focus, where I have been working with some assistants to map region-wide trends and to investigate global local dynamics in practice as well, broadly, but also in a few cases, and also starting to look at resistance to these privatization trends. So in terms of what I hope to accomplish in the next 15 minutes or so, I'll share a little bit about the conceptual orientation, a little bit about the systematic literature review, mention the kind of overarching trends that we have seen, and then if time allows, talk a little bit about the two deeper case studies that I have been focusing on before wrapping up. So I shared this a couple years ago when I made a presentation recently after joining WIAS, and I share it again because it provides a nice visual. Each of us is working in a different area of scholarship and research, and so what I take for granted, you may not take for granted. And so this is a visual that depicts the kind of the global space, the global education policy field, and the politics that I have been investigating in recent years kind of fit in the middle here, related to the global agenda for education, within which privatization is one of the stronger trends, and trying to understand how do these privatization trends play out globally, or in the case of my recent research in Latin America, kind of looking at the politics between international organizations and different low-income countries. And I always like to point out that these arrows are bidirectional. The assumption is not that the quote-unquote global is imposing something on the national or local levels, but that there is a dialectical relationship between them, so that one influences the other. There are various ways to understand this field. We can draw on political science, on political economy, or in the case of this project, policy sociology. And in short, policy sociology highlights these four dimensions. We want to understand the origins and intentions of the policy, the context in which they are produced, and the context into which they are introduced, the way that key actors interpret them, and then the actions that are taken subsequently. The systematic literature review had four kind of conceptual criteria. We wanted to map different kinds of privatization. We wanted to focus on not education in any sense, but education specifically related to kindergarten through 12th grade education in the geographic area of Latin America, and during the time period 2013 to 2023, because 10 years ago there was another review that was produced that looked at the literature prior to that. So we wanted to begin by updating the trends in the last 10 years. We started with an initial sample of over 700 studies, and in the end had a sample of 91. And through 3 rounds of review, we went from 700 to 91. Excuse me, I have something in my throat. It's interesting to note which countries are the focus of more attention. So as is common, the countries that are larger and are higher income on average have been the focus of much more scholarly attention, such as Chile, Brazil, Colombia, Mexico, etc. Um, uh, so then, on the other hand, what we see is that smaller and lower income countries receive less attention or indeed no attention. Because if you are familiar with the region, you would notice that many of the countries of Central America don't appear at all, or other countries in the Andean region such as Ecuador. And so there's variation across countries in terms of the attention they receive. And then we can also look at, as a kind of a macro level insight that I can share with you, we can look at the different trends that have emerged. And so we divide them into four, and I'll talk more about what these mean in the coming slides. But we have trends related to what you can call school autonomy and accountability, public-private partnerships, privatization through policymaking, and then a smaller group focused on how students and teachers and others are kind of working together to resist privatization trends. So in the next few slides, I'm going to talk about these not in the order of most articles, but in the kind of from top to bottom, or going from the higher to the lower levels of the system to give you kind of paint a picture of how these different trends connect. Privatization through policymaking, as the name implies, refers to the way in which in the last 20 years or so, there has been a kind of an increasing insertion of actors from the private sectors into processes of kind of policymaking, public policy related to education. And so we see, whereas, you could say that historically, education policy has been the domain of the government and of key elected officials almost exclusively. In recent decades, we see that these processes have been opened up, and we see a greater participation of a range of different private actors, including those that you see mentioned here. So bilateral and multilateral organizations, business coalitions and think tanks, and corporate philanthropies. And what we see in the last 10 years through this review is that we're seeing the appearance, the emergence, and the involvement of new types of organizations, new country contexts being affected by this trend, and new strategies and new forms of engagement. So I'll give you a sense of these things. I'm just going to focus on the last column here in my comments, but you can read what else you see there. So when it comes to multi and bilateral organizations, we see 4 or 5 strategies through which they have been influencing education reform in the region. One, by collaborating with government through education sector working groups and roundtables, by providing funding for education sector plans, or the development and the implementation of those plans, by working with and through NGOs and networks of private actors, by providing loans for education projects, and by providing technical assistance, which is key because in many low-income countries, as you might imagine, government officials oftentimes lack technical capacity, and so then they turn to a range of partners or international organizations for that. When it comes to the second group, we put business coalitions and think tanks together. And this is because although they are distinct, they operate in much the same way. And so when it comes to these kinds of actors, we see that they engage strategies such as articulating and animating networks where they didn't previously, co-laboring with government to monitor and analyze education and to develop policies and plans, they say, like, let's work together to monitor, to collect data, and then let's work together to develop the policies and plans to respond to the data, to the problems that we're seeing in the data. 3, we see that these actors promote their agendas through high-profile events, producing and launching reports, for example, and then also through producing and disseminating research related to their priorities. Because, of course, these actors are not neutral. They're primarily looking for opportunities for their members for profit making. And then the third and final group is corporate philanthropies. So here they contribute through the provision of services and resources. We see in the literature that they're contributing to programs related to leadership training, teacher professional development, physical and online technologies, or the provision of contributing to the construction of school infrastructures. Two, we see that they're working across multiple levels of government at the same time and through multiple kinds of intermediaries. So it's not that they're only working with the national level governments. We also see them working at the subnational level, particularly in larger countries where there are kind of big budgets at the subnational level. And when I say big budgets, I mean big public budgets where they want to kind of tap into and look for profit-making opportunities for their corporate parents. And then third, these philanthropies also draw on international expertise for credibility, and they leverage that credibility to kind of guide the reform process and to guide ideas about what kinds of reforms should be introduced. So overall, what can we say about the outcomes of this trend of privatization through policymaking? We see that, and I just want to reiterate that this is all just kind of like a bird's eye perspective, very macro level overview. So I'm just trying to give you a sense of what I've been doing the last few years and the kinds of things that we're seeing. Of course, the time we have available today isn't sufficient to go into all the details. So forgive me if these comments seem brief, or if you want to know more, I also want to tell you more. But okay, with regards to the outcomes, we see that international organizations can steer the policy agenda in some ways. We see that there's an emergence or a dynamic of a codependence between international organizations and governmental counterparts, which is interesting if you think about it, because each side needs the other, right? It's like these international organizations oftentimes need to legitimate themselves because through the provision of technical assistance or funding or working on project implementation, because if they don't, then their reason for being is kind of called into question. If they can't find governments who are willing to work with them, then they're not doing very well as an organization. On the other hand, you have government counterparts who see in these collaborations an opportunity for expanding their budgets, right? So we're thinking about country contexts, many of them which are low income in nature, and so they see it as appealing, partnerships with a range of international organizations because it provides, they can leverage these organizations for their own political agendas or for additional resources. And so there's an interesting dynamic which is something that I want to highlight because, at least in my field, for many people, there's this idea that the global is evil and the global level actors are able to impose their agendas or their priorities. And I always like to highlight that there's a dynamic, there's a back and forth, there's a negotiation. We shouldn't forget the agency of the national and the subnational level actors in this kind of dance. Okay, third, we see the creation of new alliances between traditional international organizations on one hand and a range of private actors on the other hand. We see that business coalitions can affect the quote unquote common sense around education, right? So particularly through their knowledge production efforts, right? So by collecting data, analyzing data, producing reports, disseminating reports, they can influence how the problems and the solutions are defined when it comes to education reform. Fifth, we see that business coalitions work with the projects of traditional international organizations to create profit opportunities, which is interesting because historically, bilateral and multilateral organizations gave money to governments, and then the governments worked together with those organizations to implement projects. But now what we're seeing is an interesting trend where the money that comes from these bilateral and multilateral organizations, sometimes that money is directly channeled to private actors, right? So you have these kind of intermediaries, right? Like there's service providers, right? So there's a whole industry of NGOs whose explicit purpose is to like they live off of these grants and these project funding from the governments of the global north. And so you kind of have like this industry that has emerged, within the kind of environment of international development, and then within that focused on education specifically. We see that tight networks have developed between old and new private actors. We also see that national and subnational philanthropies are emerging, and that these new philanthropies complement the more famous and the more high-profile international philanthropies related to Mark Zuckerberg or Bill Gates, for example, or the Clinton Global Initiative, that these philanthropies are looking for ways to connect with and to leverage their connections with those organizations. And then for the last 2 points, we see that these philanthropic organizations are working through key intermediaries to look for political opportunities. What we're seeing is the intersection of philanthropies with networks that are then connecting them to different political opportunities. And then lastly, we see that if you are in a low-income country and you want to advocate for a particular reform, it's always helpful to rely on or to leverage international expertise in order to kind of give credibility to your agenda. Given the time, I will not, in fact, talk about the two case studies, but I will before concluding, I will talk about the kind of the broad trends when it comes to the delivery. So I'm not going to talk about Paraguay and Colombia in particular, but I will talk about what these trends in privatization look like at the subnational level. So on one hand, we see that the insertion of private actors into the traditional public system. So I'm not talking here about policy making, I'm talking here about policy implementation, right? So we see that through these kinds of strategies, right? Through voucher programs, through charter schools, through subsidies and incentives and external contracts that are going to outside businesses, or through the emergence of what is called low-fee private schools. Through these kinds of actors and initiatives, we're seeing the entry into the kind of public education system of private actors for the purpose of the provision or the delivery of education. And then the other side of the coin is that within traditional public schools, where schools are not experiencing kind of explicit or traditional privatization, what we are seeing in many management principles from the business sector into the governance of public education systems, right? So we're seeing the introduction of standardization, outcomes-based accountability, reforms that are based on ideas of competition, efficiency, and effectiveness, as opposed to focusing, for example, on equity or global citizenship or other norms that could guide investment in education. We're seeing that the guiding principles are changing in a way that aligns with the private sector. Okay, and then lastly, I'll skip the two case studies, and I'll just talk about the privatization, the conclusions when it comes to privatization across the region. So there's a widespread notion that public education is of poor quality, and that creates an opening for privatization. And this notion continues to be reiterated and emphasized by as you might expect, by those organizations that stand to benefit or to profit from the privatization of education. So you kind of have like NGOs and other private companies who are kind of echoing the idea that the public sector is inherently of low quality, and that if we want to improve quality, we should move in the direction of privatization. Second, we also see that the closing of low-performing public schools contributes to the trend of privatization, because when you close low-performing public schools, if you don't replace them with other public schools, parents then are forced to put their kids in private schools. So you're kind of driving students towards private schools. Third, in a context where it's very difficult to increase funding for public education in the face of political opposition, this has led governments of the region to support private education, or else to let privatization fill in the gap left by the absence of public schools. Fourth, we see that schools are governed by accountability policies, and that these policies encourage practices that exacerbate inequality. because schools tend to select students or push students out based on their abilities, family resources, or special learning needs. The underlying idea here is that you want students who are going to make your school look good, they're going to score well on standardized tests, and that those students who require additional services, you will encourage them to enroll elsewhere, for example. And then lastly, in the face of kind of government reticence, we are seeing that movements by students, teachers, and unions can play a key role in generating support for public education, whether that means governmental funding or undoing prior privatization policies. So that's the big picture, and I will stop there. Thank you very much.